We're back again for another Tank Talk. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's once again Wednesday, and we are back at 1 p.m. CST for another Tank Talk, where this week we are going to be covering algae control in your aquarium. So we have a great presentation here put together by Dr. Nick, and I have kind of collaborated on the overall production here, and we're excited to walk through this with you guys today. Dr. Nick, thanks as always for joining us and providing obviously your insight and your expertise to all the hobbyists.
Thank you, Ian. I'm glad to do a talk that's not about sick fish this week. There's a lot of information to know about the parasites, which we've talked about before, and we'll in the future probably talk about bacteria and fungus on affecting fish. So it's nice to talk to something that's in most cases doesn't really make the fish sick. It just makes your aquarium look bad. So we're going to talk about algae control in your aquarium today, which is something that happens to all hobbyists. I've been in the fish business and keeping aquariums since I was 9 years old, and periodically I still encounter algae in my aquarium. So it's something that can never go away completely, but you can help control it and manage it. So first of all, what is algae? It's not one thing. Like we think of like what are fish? Well, fish, we have a pretty good definition, although there's even, there's the jawless fish and the jawed fish that have jaws. Lampreys don't have jaws. So even among fish, there's separations in categories. Originally, we talked about plants and animals. So everything that wasn't an animal was a plant. Now we know that there's actually multiple kingdoms besides just plants and animals. So we have fungus, which used to be considered a plant. Algae used to be considered a plant, but now we know that they're really separate from plant. They're different from plants. And the protozoa used to be considered animals, but now we know they're different than animals. So they're, protista, the protozoas are different. So algae is actually a very wide group of organisms that they may not all even be the same kingdom, that we still call them algae. So algae is a sort of a catch-all phrase for these aquatic organisms. Although we think about lichen, and there are other types of algae that live on land, but the majority of them are aquatic, both freshwater and marine. And so it's a very diverse group of primarily photosynthetic eukaryotic organisms. Eukaryotic meaning they have true cells and cell membranes and different cellular organs within that cell. So they're not plants, but they do have chlorophyll, and chlorophyll we know is the pigment cell that does the photosynthesis for plants. And so most algae are photosynthetic. And we now have decided, not me personally, but the scientists have decided that cyanobacteria, which is actually a bacteria, or maybe it's a different organism in between bacteria and algae separately. It used to be called blue-green algae, and it was considered an algae. Now they're calling it a cyanobacteria and not a true algae. But the evidence shows, based on the plastids, which is an organelle within the cells, that the plastids within all the algae came originally from cyanobacteria. So even if cyanobacteria is not considered an algae, the algae themselves developed from cyanobacteria. So that's, kind of confusing, but just another point. So we are going to talk about cyanobacteria as if it was an algae today. And there's the four main groups. So if you're lumping cyanobacteria in with the algae, there's cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae. There's chlorophyta, which are the green algae, like in the photo on this slide. There's the phyophyta, which are brown algae, and rhodophyta, which are red algae. We might also throw in there the chrysophyta, the golden algae, or the diatoms, which now maybe is not an algae, but another type of an organism. But again, we're going to be lumpers rather than splitters. We're going to throw diatoms in here as well. And then many algae are single-celled organisms that are floating around one individual cell. That one cell was split into two. So a lot of the algae that cause green water are single-celled floating algae. Some algae are individual organisms, but they clump together to form a colony. And some algae actually form macroalgae like kelp and ulva and other big seaweeds that we think of as plants, but they're actually multiple cells of algae. And they in general, the ones that are single-celled floating around are called phytoplankton, which means plant drifters. They're single-cell plants that float around, and we culture these phytoplankton to feed our anemones or our corals or other marine invertebrates. So we grow algae to feed them. Baby fish will eat on these phytoplankton. So they're a very important food source for a lot of different animals. Before we were doing these tank talks, we were doing a question and answer session on Facebook Live. And we had, for week after week after week, we had very common questions that would come back over and over. So we've decided to categorize those questions into topics. And that's why we've talked about fish nutrition, we've talked about the parasites, we've talked about water quality, and now we're talking about one of the most common problems in aquarium keeping is what do we do with algae? So some of these questions that came up on our Facebook Live question were, what causes algae to grow in my aquarium? What kinds of algae am I seeing in my aquarium? How do we get rid of that algae? Probably the most important question. And then how can we prevent it from regrowing? So those are the questions I'm going to kind of capitalize on, using those 4 questions as the themes to my talk here. So the first one is, what causes algae to grow in my aquarium? Well, that's a great question, and a lot of people don't realize what it takes to make algae grow. So some tanks have algae, some tanks don't have algae. If you have a lot of plants in your tank, you may not have as much algae, but sometimes you have plants and algae. So what's going on? So algae grows when there's abundance of nutrients, light, and carbon dioxide in the water. Carbon dioxide, if you're using an aquatic aquarium, may have a CO2 infuser to add carbon dioxide, so you may actually see increased algae growth. However, if the plants are using up all the carbon dioxide and all the nutrients and growing really well, you may see a decrease in algae. So it kind of is a balancing act between adding the appropriate amount for your plants without having leftover for the algae. Nutrients we talk about are primarily nitrogenous waste, ammonia, nitrite, and nitrate. And we've talked, and if you go back to the water quality video, you will hear us talk a lot about the ammonia, nitrite, and nitrate. So that's a really important thing to understand in the aquarium. We also talked a little bit about phosphate before. Phosphate can be in your tap water. It can come from the food. It can come from fish waste. And so sometimes we'll see an increase in phosphate. So those are the primary nutrients that we're talking about. And then light is something, if you have a lot of light, you can get algae. If you have too little light, you can sometimes get brown algae. So algae that doesn't require as much light. So it's important to understand how much light affects the plants. And then temperature. So algae grow at specific temperatures. They have a wide range of temperatures, but there's certain temperatures that they prefer to grow in, and that may be a factor in why you do or don't have algae in your aquarium. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this temperature thing. Just as an example, this was a research paper that was published in 2013, and it was the optimum temperature for growth rate of algae species. So there's a list of cyanobacteria species and a list of green algae, the chlorophyte species. And the temperature range that they tested these in was from 20 to 35 degrees Celsius. So that's about 68 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. 95 is pretty warm for aquariums. Nobody really would keep an aquarium at that temperature. Our home aquariums usually will be from 20 to 28 degrees Celsius, for about 68 to 82 Fahrenheit. Typically about 74 to 76 is pretty average for an aquarium. So about 25 Celsius. But if you look at these temperature ranges here, 25, that's the preferred temperature for this particular cyanobacteria, 27 and a half, 27, 25. Some of these are up in the 30s, which is really too warm for aquariums, but they'll still grow at lower temperatures, not quite as fast. But you see several of them that aquarium temperature is the ideal temperature for that cyanobacteria to grow. If we look at the chlorophytes, there's a couple that are in the 30s, but 35, 32, 32, but most of them are 27, 27, 27, 27. And again, that 27 is about 88, 81 degrees. So it's a little warm for most tropical fish. Bettas and discus and a few other fish do like that warmer temperature. But still, we can see that this normal aquarium temperature, especially for freshwater fish, some marine fish might be at cooler temperatures, is pretty typical for the temperature that the algae would prefer to grow in. So that's one of the reasons what we're likely to see algae in our aquariums. Okay, so the next thing is we talked about why do we get algae? How do we keep it out of the aquarium? So good water quality is a must, and this is, how do we get rid of diseases? How do we get rid of algae? How do we keep our aquarium fish healthy? All goes back to water quality. So if you haven't watched the water quality video, go back and watch that one. But water quality is so important, which means measuring your water quality and doing water changes as needed to keep the water quality good. So how ammonia, nitrite, nitrate, and phosphate we talked about. Those are things that should be tested. Temperature you should understand. This water quality can be affected by food. Anytime you've put too much food in it, the fish don't eat it. Those extra food that's in there starts to decay. You'll increase your ammonia, nitrite, nitrate, and phosphate. So how do you prevent those from going up? Feed the right amount of food, maybe 1 or 2 meals a day, about 3 to 5 minutes at a time. Any fish that haven't eaten after that time, if there's food left over, take it out. Now, we do have nocturnal feeders we have to think about. If you only put food in the daytime, they may not eat. So you have to take into consideration feeding at night if you have fish that normally only would eat at night. The lighting, you want to make sure you have the appropriate amount of light, not too much, not too little. I would recommend about 8 to 10 hours a day, and also avoid natural sunlight. Sunlight can definitely stimulate algae growth in the aquarium. Um, if you do have too much nutrients, improve your filter, add media to your filter that'll take out nitrate, that'll take out phosphate, that'll help reduce that. And then we're going to talk at length a little bit more about algae eaters, both fish and invertebrate algae eaters. That's another way of controlling algae in your aquarium. So this is just a photo. This actually is from my aquarium at home, and I do have some blackbeard algae growing on the leaves of this, or on the roots of this anubias. Anubias is an interesting plant. It'll grow roots right from the stems. You can break those stems off and replant it. It'll just keep growing. My anubias I've had growing since 2009, and it just keeps growing bigger and bigger, and I break it apart and make baby anubias out of it. And it just does well. But on this side, you can see the normal roots. On this side, probably a little bit older roots that have some blackbeard algae growing on it. So fortunately, it's very minimal in there. I haven't really worried about it, but I do have some growing on there. And this ties into then a question that we had in: what do I do about blackbeard algae growing on my jungle vallisneria at the surface of my tank? So one thing about this particular algae is it likes to grow on plant leaves. If it's growing on your gravel, you can take the gravel out and disinfect it. You can bleach it, rinse it, put some sodium thiosulfate in it to take out the chlorine, put it back in your tank, done. Same with your ornaments. With the plants, you can't really bleach your plants. So sometimes you can take a little bit of the 3% hydrogen peroxide and use that to put on your leaves and see if that can help get some of it off. If the plant has some really like older leaves that are badly covered with blackbeard algae, but the other leaves are okay, you can pinch off those bad leaves to get the blackbeard algae out of your tank. So cleaning the plants and cleaning the glass, bleach any of the ornaments, use some hydrogen peroxide. That all may help get rid of it. Check your ammonia, nitrite, nitrate, and phosphate. Lower those levels if any of them are high, and reduce your lighting. There are some products we're going to talk about in a minute that you can add, commercial products that'll help reduce algae growth as well. So in a saltwater aquarium, how can I get rid of the red slime algae in my aquarium? This is a great picture of red slime algae growing on the corals and the rocks in a marine aquarium. And again, it's the same thing. Fortunately, this doesn't stick to the surfaces like the blackbeard algae does. So you can use a gravel vacuum and siphon this off. A lot of times it'll come off if you just clean it, or you go in there with a brush and clean it off and then gravel vacuum it out. Keeping the water more agitated. You don't want to do it too much, depending on whether other species are in your tank, but enough to keep the water a little higher motility, may keep it from settling on. Maintaining the proper pH. Sometimes your pH over time will start to drift lower. So you raise your pH for 8.2, 8.3, 8.4 may help reduce it. Keep your water buffered with either buffers or Kalkwasser, which is German for calcium water, which is a supplement you can add to your aquarium to raise the alkalinity. Raising the alkalinity will keep the pH from dropping, so it's a good buffer. If you have a lot of ammonia, nitrate, or phosphate in your water, you can do a reverse osmosis to take it out and then add your C mix in it to get more pure water when you're doing your water changes. And then just if you start seeing any algae growing, cleaning it off before it has a chance to spread. So those are just some ideas, again, to get rid of some of these algae in the marine aquarium. And a real common type of algae we see, especially in the freshwater, is the cyanobacteria, which will form sheets. And I've seen aquariums that it seems like overnight they'll just get a sheet of this algae growing across the bottom, the cyanobacteria, whether it's a bacteria or algae or something in between. So it's commonly called the blue-green algae. It is photosynthetic gram-negative bacteria, and it grows in that nutrient-rich water we talked about earlier. It can grow very, very quickly and cover the whole surface of along the bottom of the aquarium. But the good thing is usually you can gravel vacuum it out. So if you just repeatedly gravel vacuum it every day as you see it start to grow, you can get it out. And then also by doing your water changes with the gravel vacuum, get rid of the nutrients that it's needing. So the water changes may help. And then worst case scenario, it can be treated since it is a bacteria or something like a bacteria. It can be treated with an antibiotic, and erythromycin works well. I've used it, treated it with erythromycin before, 2.5 milligrams per liter of water every other day, and it will kill off the cyanobacteria fairly quickly. So that's good. But the downside is you may also affect the bacteria in your biofilter. So you may have to do more frequent water changes because you might get an ammonia spike if you kill off the good bacteria that's in your biofilter. So maybe have a secondary biofilter media on reserve that you can switch out and switch them out as you're using the antibiotic to keep your biofilter active. But this is fairly common, and it's not as hard to treat as some of the other ones, but it can be pervasive and keep coming back over and over again. The chlorophyta are the green algae. A lot of these are like hair algae, filamentous algae like Cladophora. It'll grow on here. You can see kind of hanging on the rocks where it's not even totally submerged, but just the water running across like stones on a riverbed, and it'll grow on it's wet. I've seen it in koi ponds, hanging from waterfalls where it just gets wet. But not necessarily submerged. Spirogyra is another long branching filamentous algae, and so they call them, hair algae or thread algae, and they can get pretty tough and sometimes hard to remove. In my aquarium, I often will see that green spot algae that just grows on the glass, and you have to take a little scraper and rub on it, and it'll come off, but it doesn't just rub off easily with your fingers. You have to use an algae scraper to get it off. And then another type of green algae we'll see is just a green water. And especially in a new aquarium that hasn't been fully cycled, so you get a lot of ammonia and nitrite, you might see your water turn green initially, or in a pond when you first set up a pond and your water will turn green. You can use UV lights to kill this floating green algae. The UV lights won't work on algae that's attached to the rocks or ornaments in your aquarium, but it will get rid of algae that's floating in the water. So koi pond people, frequently you will have a UV light on their pond, and it'll keep the green algae blooms from making the water cloudy. The Phaeophyta is the brown algae. These are mostly when you think of seaweed. This is what we're talking about. So kelps and ulva and things like that. And most of these are macroalgae that we actually like. And some people will grow these in their aquariums. The fish will eat it. Around the world, these are consumed by people. So it's actually an important seafood, in especially seaweed wrappers for sushi and other seaweeds. So these are in general more beneficial, and we don't really see these as problematic algae in your aquarium. But sometimes you'll see some brown algae growing that you don't want. And so again, monitor the light, monitor the nutrient level to try to keep them broken down. And then the red algae, this infamous blackbeard algae we talked about. These are these dark fuzzy algae. They really stick hard on things, so they're hard to remove. They're hard to just scrape off or rub off, and they can grow reds, browns, blacks, different colors. And then the staghorn algae, it has these long gray-green branching strands, and they like a lot of light on those, so they may grow all the way up to the light or near the light. So those, again, those are the different types of algae that we see. And so sometimes you don't need to identify what kind of algae you have. We'll just treat them all essentially the same way, but sometimes it's nice to know. And then the diatom algae, these have a silica shell, so they're different from the other type of algae, which is why they may or may not be considered true algae, but we'll lump them in today because in aquariums, they cause a similar problem. You might see this yellow or golden film that grows on things, the side of the aquarium or on the plants or things. The interesting thing about diatoms is you can usually rub them with your fingers and rub them off. So if it comes off real easily and it's sort of a brownish golden color, it's probably diatoms that are growing on your tank. And there's two different shapes of these. There's the centric, which is circular, and pinnate, which is the pointed at each end. And those are the two different body shapes, although there's many, thousands of different kinds of diatoms. But sometimes if you're doing biopsies on fish, which I do frequently, I did some today even, that you will find diatoms maybe in their gill tissue or maybe on their fins if they have a lot of mucus, and they might not be a problem at all, just a commensal in the water, and it happens to get stuck on the fish. But if you have them in large numbers, they can make the water cloudy or they can stick onto the surfaces. So how do you get rid of these? Well, here's a really good example right there, cleaning your aquarium. I use the algae scrapers on the green algae that grows on my glass. It's not a real bad problem, so maybe once a month I might do it, or along with some water changes, and that usually takes care of it. Plecostomuses are good for taking care of this, but manual cleaners or scrapers work really well. So what other things can you use? Well, we've talked already about water quality, so definitely test your water, measure your phosphate, ammonia, nitrite, nitrate, make sure they're all really low, 0 for ammonia, 0 for nitrite, up to maybe 5 or 10 for nitrate. If it's much higher than 40, you're definitely going to start seeing problems. So 5 to 10 is really where you want to start doing water changes. If it gets higher than that, phosphate, we really want it about 0.5, 0.3, maybe even less milligrams per liter. So doing your partial water change may help, but one of the important things is test your tap water or whatever your water source is. If it's well water, if it's tap water, if you have phosphate or nitrate or sometimes even ammonia in your source water, doing water changes might not help. So you may need to filter that water. You might need to get an RO filter, and for salt water, RO works great because then you add in your salt mix to it to get all the minerals that you want back in. If you're in fresh water, you can't just use straight RO water because there's no minerals in it. That's really bad for the fish. So if you're using an RO water, you then have to get a mineral mix to put back in. And it could be, sometimes you just use your salt mix at a lower salt salinity. So instead of a 3.5%, you use it at 0.1% or 0.5% of seawater, sea mix into your RO water to get the minerals back in. And that can work too. So test your tap water, make sure it's correct, and then use bottled water, RO water, or some form of filtered water if your tap water is high in ammonia, nitrite, nitrate, or phosphate. You can also use phosphate removers. So if phosphate's the problem, there are phosphate removing chemicals that you can add to your water, or there's phosphate removing media that you can put in your filter. All of those need to be periodically used, so the filter media would need to be changed. Yeah, and again, if you're measuring it with a phosphate test kit, you'll know when to change your filter when it starts going up. So if you have a lot of plants in your aquarium, they do need some phosphate. So between 0.5 and 1 milligram per liter, or 0.1 part 0.5 parts per million. 1 milligram in a liter is 1 part per million, so they're interchangeable. So we typically like to use milligrams per liter. If you don't have live plants, then you can keep the phosphate level lower, so maybe 0.3 to 0.5. And then salt water, you want to make sure you're not using a salt mix that has phosphate in it that will raise your phosphate, unless you have certain type of things that need phosphate. But most of the time, we want to keep our phosphate down to 0.3 milligrams per liter or less in the salt water. Because the higher the phosphate, the more potential for algae growth. And so to get rid of phosphate, there's a number of products on the market that you can buy. PhosGuard, Phosphate E is chemical that you put in the water. It will precipitate the phosphate out into a solid. The phosphate will then either settle to the bottom of the tank or get picked up by your filter and get it trapped in your filter media. So you then clean your filter or gravel vacuum your water, and you'll be removing that phosphate. Now, I've had situations where the phosphate was so high that when you add the medication or the chemical to remove the phosphate, the water will turn like milk. It'll get milky white. And of course, then we started seeing fish loss because that precipitation of phosphate minerals will get on the fish's gills and block their gills, and that can cause fish death. So my recommendation, if you're using this, put a little bit in it first. See how milky your water gets. If it's not too bad, then you can keep adding a little bit more, a little bit more. If you start seeing your water turn white, starting to get a lot of precipitate building up, stop adding it, do your partial water change, and then gradually add a little bit more and a little bit more. So as your phosphate level drops by gradually adding it, you'll eventually eliminate the phosphate without adding too much. So just be careful if you're using chemicals like this, you don't add too much too soon and then make the water all milky. If it does get too milky, just do a water change on it. Make sure you're using phosphate-free water source. But this has worked really well in certain cities that actually have phosphate in the tap water. And you may not know it, but some cities add phosphate to the tap water because the phosphate prevents lead from leaching into the water. So if you have a city that has a lot of old lead pipes in it, the lead level can build up in the water. So by adding phosphate, it reduces the lead in the water, which is great for people, but it's not good for your fish. So then you have to get rid of the lead and the phosphate. The other thing we talked a little bit about initially is things that make the ammonia, nitrite, nitrate, and phosphate go up is organic debris. So how do you get rid of it? So cleaning your filter on a regular basis, doing water changes, gravel vacuuming. Those are all very, very helpful. Sometimes you'll see in your tubing, you'll get this like the blackbeard algae or sludge or slime building up inside the plastic tubing in your filter. So there are some things that you can use to get rid of that. Different products like the API EcoFix, Laguna BioSludge, and there's other products available through usually enzymes that break down this sludge and make it into soluble components that then you can remove through water changes. So if you're starting to see a bunch of stuff building up in your gravel and you can't thoroughly gravel vacuum it, or building up in your pipes or in your filter media, you can use some of these products to put into your filter or into your aquarium that will help break down that sludge. So getting rid of that sludge and then doing your water change will definitely help reduce these nutrients from the organic debris in your aquarium, all of which add to essentially fertilizer for algae. Lighting, sometimes that can be hard to control, but definitely if your aquarium's by a window or by the sun, you can put a shade or blinds up to help lower the light that gets in it. Uh, you may have too much light, but if you're getting brown algae, you may have too little light. So it can go either way. But typically, if you avoid sunlight or bright light from a window and you only have your light on for about 8 to 10 hours a day, that should be sufficient to reduce the algae growth as long as the water quality is good. And so this is just some information I found about lighting levels. So how much is right? It depends on your aquarium, depends on how deep your water is, how far your lights are above the water. So you may need to use different watts per gallon based on your own needs. But here's, consider medium lighting about 2 to 3 watts per gallon. So in a 20-gallon aquarium, you'd have maybe a 50-watt light bulb should be sufficient. Now we're using LED lighting instead of fluorescent lighting, so it's a little bit different because LED lighting can actually sometimes be even brighter at the same wattage, or actually a much lower wattage. But that's just a little information about lights, and you can just kind of see where you are measuring the watts of your light versus how big your aquarium is. It's important to talk about algicides because, again, they're commercially available. They do work with some precautions. So here's a couple brands. The Aquarium Pharmaceuticals has one, the Algae Fix, and Tetra has one called Algae Control. There's lots of other brands available. If you look at the ingredients, they're actually very similar ingredients. So essentially, they're the same ingredients, just different chemical compounds of that common main ingredient. And what these are designed to do is to kill the plants, and they can kill your live plants as well as algae. So if you have a planted aquarium, these may not be as good for you. But you might try them at lower levels and see how they do. The other thing is what I have seen repeatedly in both online forums and in my own meeting different aquarists. They'll contact me and say, oh, I added the algae fix or the algae medicine and my fish died. And it's like, well, most of these are not really toxic to fish. They're not made to work on the fish. But here's what happens. You put in a chemical that's killing the algae. The algae dies. Now you have suddenly abundance of organic waste that's in your aquarium. That organic waste is broken down by bacteria, but in the process releases ammonia and uses oxygen. So especially in koi ponds where this will happen frequently is you add a bunch of algae fix in there or algae medication in there, the algae will die off and then the fish will start dying a little bit later after that. And it's really not the algae chemical killed them, it's the dead algae causing changes in the water quality that kills them. So you want to make sure you have good aeration if you're using any product like this, maybe doing some water changes, the day after you use it to get rid of any ammonia that's building up because of dead algae. And if you can, manually remove as much algae out of the pond as possible so it's not left in the pond or in the aquarium to decay. Some of these, however, are also toxic to invertebrates, so be sure you read the instructions before using them to see how they're usable with invertebrates. So this is just a simple slide I put in here of a test I ran on a product just to see how well it worked. So this was using the algae quell, and we added it into this aquarium. This is a small, probably a 5-gallon aquarium. And if you look on this little hut here, it's got a lot of algae growing on the hut. It's got algae growing on the rocks, algae growing in the gravel. And so I followed the instructions. I put it in here. The fish did fine. This tank has some guppies in it. And in a week after using it, I definitely did see some results. It didn't cure it completely, but you see the gravel is pretty white now. It's taken out a lot of the algae off the gravel. It's a little bit less growth on the top of the hut here, maybe on the palm tree ornament. So it does look like it's improving. So it did kill off the algae a little bit. In order to be successful, you'd probably have to use this repeatedly for maybe several weeks. And again, if you're using it at lower levels so it doesn't kill the algae all at once, it's less likely to cause that water quality problem we talked about. But this was just a slide I had because I did actually run some tests on some of these products previously to see how well they worked. And yeah, they do work, and you just got to, keep using them until the problem's solved. So that is one option if you didn't want to go to cleaning all the ornaments by hand and putting them back into the tank. Now, living algae controllers may be one of your best suggestions for a solution. And depending on what fish you have in your tanks, what you can add to it, a mono shrimp are actually pretty good algae eating shrimp. And so they're effective in cleaning off, especially hair algae, and they'll move around the tank. They'll eat it off the plants, they'll eat it off the ornaments. So they're pretty good as long as you don't have aggressive fish that are going to eat your shrimp. Otocinclus are very, very tiny fish. They work great, but they're very small, so they don't eat a lot. So you can add Otocinclus even into very, very small aquariums because they're such small fish, and those will help. We talked about Plecostomus as well. Those will work pretty good. Siamese algae eaters are one of the more effective eating fish, and they work pretty good even eating blackbeard algae. And then their snails are good. Some snails will reproduce too rapidly, and ram's horn snails and pond snails, they're not really good for eating the algae, and you can get an overgrowth of them in your tank. But the nearite snails seem to work pretty well. The nearite snails are breed in saltwater. So if you're putting them in a freshwater aquarium, you don't have to worry about them overpopulating your tank. And they do eat the algae, so those may be pretty good to use in a freshwater tank and a saltwater aquarium, but they may reproduce in the saltwater aquarium. So mollies are also algae eaters, and they can sometimes help nibble the algae off, especially on the plants. And then we mentioned Plecostomus. Now, if you have a big aquarium, you can use the hyphen Plecostomus or the common Plecostomus. But remember, those get about 18 inches long, so they're not good for a 10-gallon aquarium. They're not good for a 50-gallon aquarium. Maybe 75-gallon, you'd be okay. These get really big, so be very careful when you're buying plecos not to get those if you have a small aquarium. There are some plecos that do stay smaller. I love these bristle-nosed plecos. This is actually a picture of fish in my aquarium. That's my male bristle-nosed pleco. He's probably about 6, 7 years old now, and black molly, black sailfin molly, and they do a pretty good job keeping the algae clean off the tank. They may not eat it off everything, and he has not eaten the blackbeard algae, so I'm still having trouble with that, but they do a pretty good job. But the bristle nose and the rubber lip plecos only get about 5 inches long, so those are okay for 10 or maybe 10-gallon, but definitely bigger than 10-gallon aquariums. You could put one of them in those. The Siamese algae eater, I wanted to talk specifically about that one because there are many fish that look very similar that are also algae eaters that may be helpful, but they're not quite as good. So the true Siamese algae eater is one of the better ones to get. Sometimes they're hard to find, sometimes they're hard to identify, but they have only a single black stripe that runs all the way down their body from the tip of the nose all the way to the tail fin and onto the tail fin to the center of the fork of the tail fin. It tends to get more narrow on the tail fin, the caudal fin, as it gets to the fork. And these fish are not aggressive like sometimes like the flying fox can be or the Chinese algae eater. So definitely try to find the true Siamese algae eater if you're going to get one for your aquarium. And this is a chart that was kind of helpful. So the Siamese algae eater is this one. You see it has the little point at the tip of the black stripe as it goes onto the fin. The Chinese algae eater has the black stripe, but it also has spots on it, gets a little bit bigger, and sometimes can be aggressive, especially as it gets large. It can actually get onto other fish and start sucking the slime off of fish. I've seen that happen in goldfish before, where in a tank of goldfish, it'll actually suck onto the goldfish side. And then the Gara tenuata, it does have the line, but it also has some colors on top of it, the little gold stripe. And then the flying fox, you see, has the black stripe above as well as the main lateral line black stripe. And the black stripe also goes on to the tail fin, but is wider. So this will just help you identify when you go to the fish store to try to get the true Siamese algae eater. Okay, so now I've given you sort of the general gist of the algae control problem. If you want to learn more information, there are some great articles on liveaquaria.com. There's a link here that has the different articles. So there's specific for freshwater algae, saltwater algae, blackbeard algae, red slime, all the different types of algae you might have a problem with. If you go to liveaquaria.com, find this link on the information section under algae, and then you'll be able to look up some specific articles for more information. And then this is some of the information I use, those articles, plus from a few other sources to get some of the background information for this talk. So hopefully that will give you an overview of algae. Bottom line, water quality, algae eating fish or invertebrates, and keeping your phosphate level down, and then just cleaning as needed on your regular weekly or monthly maintenance to keep the algae down in your aquarium. So I hope that's helpful. It's not a bunch of disease stuff this time, but we'll get back into that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nick. I think we covered a lot of great things here. Thank you, everybody. Until next time, have a great rest of your week.